Okay, the next part is a lot of vocabulary words. So the first thing talks about different kinds of disease, so infectious versus non-infectious. So infectious is usually caused by a microbe, so it could be a virus, it could be a bacterium, it could be fungus. Okay, now a non-infectious disease, okay, is something that could be genetic or environmental, or maybe we don't understand the cause. So something like cancer or diabetes. Right now, this vaping lung disease is environmental. So infectious versus non-infectious. Communicable and non-communicable. So communicable can be spread from one person to the other, while non-communicable is not typically spread. Then contagious. Contagious means it spreads. So I always kind of think communicable and contagious are very similar. There's not a lot of difference between those in my mind. Now you can have something that's infectious that doesn't spread. So like a toothache or appendicitis. So that can be caused by bacterial infection, but you can't spread it from one person to the other. Okay, now what causes bacterial pathogenicity? So one thing, and we've already talked about this, are adherence factors, so things like capsules, also enzymes. So this picture tries to show you two different enzymes that can increase pathogenicity. So one of them is hyaluronidase, which I know we talked about in maybe chapter 4 or 5. So hyaluronidase breaks apart connective tissue so that the pathogen can spread and get into deeper tissue. And then streptokinase breaks apart, dissolves blood clots. Okay, now bacterial toxins are in two categories. So endotoxins or exotoxins. So endotoxins come from gram-negative. Example is lipopolysaccharide, which we've talked about before, which causes fever, can lead to vasodilation and shock. And endotoxins are only released when gram-negative cells die. Exotoxins, there's a lot more types of them. They come from gram-positive. Gram-positive can secrete proteins. They can be very powerful. So things like botulism toxin is an example of an exotoxin, and they cause specialized tissue damage. So they only damage one kind of tissue. So one example of an exotoxin is hemolysin. So hemo is blood, lysin is breaking it apart. So we break apart blood. So an example of that is Streptococcus pyogenes, which causes strep throat. Okay, now eukaryotic pathogens, they have they cause problems different ways. So algae, you might have heard about this summer. There was a blue-green algae in ponds in our area that somebody had their dog swim in a pond and had blue-green algae, and it produces toxins, right? And the toxins killed the dogs in the pond. So another example of an algae that can cause problems is red tide. So fungi produce toxins as well, so they can actually kill you. So they can, like poisonous mushrooms, produce pretty bad toxins. They also can produce things like LSD that cause hallucinations, and that can, I guess, depends on what you want to do with it. But if animals eat it, it can be bad. Protozoa can cause release toxins and cause diarrhea. So like amoeba. This is a picture of Giardia. So Giardia is found in the water. You can, if you drink water, Giardia, that's right. You can drink contaminated water and get Giardia in your intestines. And this is the scars that they leave. The sucker leaves in the intestines. And then helminths are worms. So worms cause nutrient deficiency. Now, it's not good to have worms. Okay, now here's a whole big list of vocabulary words. So a symptom is what the patient feels. So they have a headache or they feel nauseous, okay? And the sign is what the healthcare provider can see. A syndrome is a group of signs and symptoms, so it's a whole bunch of things together. So maybe you have a rash and you have a headache and itchy eyes or something. Okay, sequelae are an after effect of a disease. So one example of this is if you have a strep infection, so you have strep throat. Strep is known to cause certain sequelae. It can damage the heart valves, and it can also damage the kidneys. So it's after the fact. So it's not the initial thing, but it can cause long-term damage. Okay, acute disease, it means it's sudden and severe, comes on and you're sick, really sick immediately. And chronic is long-term, right? So maybe something like Lyme disease. Subacute disease is kind of in between. And the example that she uses in the book is periodontal disease, so gum disease. So it's kind of in between, like you can have flare-ups. So gingivitis is what I was trying to write there. Latent disease, it's not observable at first. Okay, so maybe HIV or herpes, something like that, that you might have it but you don't know it. Hepatitis B is another good example of that. Local and focal, to me, seem very similar. So local is localized, it's in a specific area of the body. So maybe you have an infection in your toe. And focal is it starts in one area. And then systemic means it's spread throughout the body. So if somebody's septic, right, it's spread throughout their body. Disease terminology. So bacteremia just means you have bacteria in the blood. But septicemia means that you have them in the blood and they're multiplying. So that's the two difference. One, bacteremia, they're just in there, but if you're septic, they're in there and they're multiplying. Viremia is viruses in the blood, and sapremia means that you have organisms that are eating dead tissue. So a saprophyte is something that eats dead tissue. Okay, a primary infection is the first infection, so maybe you have a virus, so you get a cold, and then from the cold you have a lot of mucus, and the mucus is a really wonderful place for bacteria to grow. So then you get a secondary infection, which is bacterial. So you start out with the virus and they're like, well, we can't give you an antibiotic for it. But then when you come back 3 weeks later and you still have a problem, like you might have an ear infection or a sinus infection, that is a secondary infection. Okay, superinfection we talked about. So that's when the microflora are messed up, and something it becomes something that is an opportunist takes over. Mixed infection means there's more than one organism, and then inapparent means it's not obvious that there is an infection there. So that could be something like HIV. Okay, now in the disease stages, okay, so we have incubation. So that's number one. Incubation is when the organism is present and is starting to multiply. And then prodromal is when you start to feel bad. So that's when you're like, oh, I'm going to get sick and something's not right. So you're starting to feel like something is wrong. And then invasive, and then will peak. And when they peak, they call that acme. So that's the peak. So invasive is it goes up. Okay, and that's might be when they say the fever broke. So the fever breaks and you start to feel better, and that's decline, which is 4, and then convalescence is at the bottom. It's when you're starting to feel better and you're recovering. So they used to call nursing homes convalescent homes. So convalescent means you're recovering or rehabbing. Okay, now this is just an interesting graph, I think, and it's not really up to date, but it just is factors influencing infectious disease. So how do we prevent them? So some of the things that influence it are that more healthcare is available, things that there can be new pathogens, there can be migration, and immigration can bring disease in. So if you look, here's infectious diseases, okay, and then here's infectious diseases. So it's been significantly decreased because of antibiotics, better hygiene, things like that.